So our topic tonight, you heard it, is how we can and may and will use tech to change our brains and behavior. And we are trying to look beyond perspectives of utopia or apocalypse. So we're going to ask sincerely, how can tech enhance attention? How can it improve our performance? And should we, and how, if, change our education system to make room for that? Our first guest, you've heard it, is Daphne Bavelier. She's a professor at the University of Geneva and the director of the Brain and Learning Lab there. And she studies how the brain adapts to changes in experience from the outside, whether it be nature, a natural forest, or video games. You've heard that. And you've heard it mentioned, she was quoted all over, and I've specifically asked her permission to mention this again. She's made thousands of teenagers happy with the insight that shooting games are not as bad as many parents feared. Daphne, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me tonight. Thank you to all of you for having fighting the cold and managed to get up here down here so that we can have this little time together. I'm going to try to deconstruct some of the introduction I couldn't understand in German. But yes, there is some truth to having children very excited about my work until, especially adolescent, until I tell them, well, no, really go and read the methods section in our papers. And then I see some frowning, and they realize that our studies are based on doing training, as I'm going to show you, but in very reasonable doses compared to what your teenagers may actually be doing at home. And that's a source of major disappointment. So I'm going to try to give you some ammunition if you have some of those young ones at home. I've been studying for almost 20 years, playing first or third-person shooter games that we called action video games at the time. The name of those games, as you probably know, is to go after the zombies, the bad guy, get to them before they get to you. Not what we ever thought about when we think about a mind-enhancing activity. But we found that playing those games can have positive effect. And some of the research I'd like to actually present so that you understand how we proceed, because there's lots of different ways to do studies on media use and impact on behavior. What we do is really quantitative studies of the impact of playing those video games on the brain and on your behavior. And I'm going to take an example from vision. Which right now my vision is really bad. I can't see any of you because I'm totally blinded by this. Maybe I need to be a little bit back here. What we have is to have participants come to the lab and we test their vision. So we actually measure, for example, how small of a print they can read. You know, when you're reading, like, on the prescription box, it's those of you that are young will not understand what I mean, but at one age, you begin to really have to squint in order to read it. That's your resolution of your vision, something you correct with your glasses. Well, we measure that. We measure you with your glasses on, whichever correction you have. And then we divide the pool of participants into two groups. One group, which is forced to play those action video games, first-person or third-person shooter games, and another group, which is required to play commercially available games also, but that have very different feel, like, for example, social simulation games or puzzle games. In the study I'm thinking of, we required participants to play for 50 hours. And no, it's not 50 hours in 3 days. It's 50 hours over a period of 10 to 12 weeks. That is no more than 5 hours per week and no more than 1 hour per day. Small distributed practice. So everybody was playing their respective games. And then after the 50 hours were finished, a few days later, we tested again the visual capabilities of participants. And what we found is that those participants that have been trained on the action video games improved their vision such that they could actually read finer print on the letters or the different shapes that we were showing compared to the one that had been trained on the other control games. This was interesting in and of itself, but there's more to life than just having good vision. And what really caught our attention is that these effects were also seen in other aspects of our cognitive functioning. And I'm going to show you a study on mental rotation, which was done by colleagues at the University of Toronto, where they tested mental rotation abilities with paper and pencil tests of this kind, where there's a reference shape shown all the way back there, if I get here. And then participants are being asked to say which of the 4 test shapes here are actually a rotated version of that reference shape. So if you actually do it, you will be able to see that it is the 3rd one, yeah. And in that study, they had participants come in, have booklets of these little problems, and that gave them the pre-testing baseline. Then they assigned participants to one of 2 groups. One group that played action video game, other group that played control games. This was a 10-hour training study, not 10 hours in one day, 10 hours over 2 weeks. And then a few days later, and even a few months later, they got participants to come back and to test again on a different set of problems, but the same type of mental rotation task. And what they found is that the one that were trained on the action video game improved, the one that were trained on the control game didn't improve. So this kind of work raised the question of what are really the mechanisms at hand? Like, how come we see those changes? And what we have been able to unpack through 20 years of research is that the first change has to do with being able to make more correct decisions per unit of time. And this is actually brought about by changes in attention, in what we call attentional control, which is his ability to focus on the task at hand and ignore source of distraction or noise. This has everyday value. There is, for example, research showing that training with action video games enhances the distribution of attention, and that's something that benefits children when they learn to read, because there's part of reading which has to do with how do you deploy your attention over the page in order to parse the page and the word one-on-one. We have also been able to show, using brain imaging, that there are deep changes in one very specific network of attention, which we call the dorsal network of attention, which happens to be located in your frontal and parietal cortex, and that change in its automaticity. So I gave you a 5-minute tour of 20 years of research. So there's more questions you'll be happy to answer. But here I want to take a step back and get you to think about what you typically hear in the media. There's probably not a week that goes by without you being exposed to some report or like headlines in newspapers about how bad new technologies are for our children or for us. Here I'm telling you an example of technology playing action video games, which is good. So who should you believe, right? Like, why is there so much confusion? And there's a lot of confusion because a lot of studies focus on screen time, which is measuring how long you spend in front of a screen, whether it's a computer screen, a tablet, an iPhone screen. And some studies find positive effects, some studies find negative effects. It's true that it's really a zoo. And there was a brilliant study that was published a year ago showing on a sample of more than 300,000 participants, adolescents, that screen time is basically irrelevant. If you look at screen time, you can get everything and nothing. In their study, they showed that with that huge sample, the impact of screen time on the well-being of adolescents was the same as having potatoes in your diet. That is a small negative impact that is so small that it's really hard to detect. And screen time is irrelevant because what matters is really the technology that you use. Different technologies have different impact. I actually showed you that through the work with video games. Even within video games, we contrasted action video games to other video games, social simulation games or strategy games or puzzle games. So it's important to be very specific, and we know enough, for example, that in the case of new technologies and cognitive fitness, there are at least 5 factors we need to pay attention to. I've briefly flashed them here, but the type of media is important. You won't get the same impact on brain and behavior from social media than from video game. You have to worry about content. You have to look about how the content is being delivered. You don't get the same effect delivering through a VR helmet than through a computer screen. You have to look at how the interaction is actually layered down, and that has a huge impact. And the context of use, it's a very different impact whether you're playing with 5 other friends and connecting and chatting, or being like, a loner and never interacting with any other human being. And so all of these will actually matter in the type of effects that you're going to see. The other big determinant of the impact of technology use is actually the user itself, himself or herself. Like, there are different types of users, and for example, in the case of problematic interactive media use, we know that some children and some adults are more susceptible than others. We need to take that into account, and it is our responsibility to direct the industry to best practices and avoid pitfalls. But there's also the other side of that coin, where we need to realize as a society that we have a very much a double standard toward what's a virtuous use or actually pernicious use. If you look at internet gaming disorders or this problematic interactive media use, there is a very strong negative stigma, and children or adolescents that are labeled with that are actually being pulled off. In China, they are actually being sent to some specific re-education schooling. So there's something that is very traumatic and not valued at all. There is another literature which looks at mixed blessing addiction. Mixed blessing addiction is a kind of addiction probably 60% of you in this room has, including me, addiction to work. If you looked at me, the number of hours that I spend on my computer screen is insane. I write papers, I write grants, I prepare talks, I interact on email, I sort of do Skype for my work meeting. I'm basically glued to the screen. And none of you would come to me and say, hey, we need to put you in rehab. No, but think about it, and that has actually a huge mental cost. Those young adolescents that we stigmatize with this internet gaming addiction label are going to live it as I have a problem. And work addiction, if it actually leads to burnout and things like that, is a problem. But we need to separate these and be very, very granular and precise on where the problem is and where it starts, and not actually cut to the chase and make big headlines. We really need careful ways of proceeding. And finally, I'd like to open a little bit the stage in terms of thinking about how to use new technologies for human enhancement, which is something that as a brain scientist, the next waves of new technologies are not the ones that you have in your hands right now. They're going to be directly implanted in your brains. What should we do? How should we conceive of those? And what are the best guidelines? And obviously, we should aim at having this technology enhance the well-being of individuals. But what's very often missed in this discussion is also the well-being of the communities, and that communities and individuals are actually not necessarily aligned in their well-being, and that there may be a price to pay at the individual level such that the community actually has a healthy use of the technologies. And I'll be delighted to talk about that more. But right now, I'm going to thank you for your attention and give back the spot to
you. May stay on stage. Thank you very much, Daphne. So the idea tonight is that we all, you as an audience, we talk with Daphne and among each other. So we're going to have a very open interaction rather than us talking, waiting for you for the last 5 minutes to have forgotten the questions you wanted to ask. So I'm going to open up very soon, but first I will take my privileged position and ask Daphne something I wanted to ask her. I've read about your paper in Nature Human Behavior, and my first question would be, when you look at environments and how they can, or how we can enhance humans, is there, looking at the brain, a difference whether I interact with the forest, a real forest, or a forest in a video game?
So there are differences in the brain. There are going to be differences, but it may be because we're not yet there with interactive media, right? So we actually know from research on teaching through a VR headset versus teaching through a computer screen that some of the experiences that we create are extremely engaging. So experiences in the VR and like you're totally immersed, extremely engaging, extremely well rated by students. But for example, they don't learn as much than when they do it on the computer screen. And this is work from
not
Rich.
As much.
They do not learn as much. And this is work from Rich Mayer at UC Santa Barbara. And part of it may be that the students, when you are in like interactive with this forest, they are actually component of that forest that are not yet well calibrated or well understood. And so you get actually distracted by all this kind of new ways of seeing the world that engineers have put into the software, but that has actually counter effects because it gets you distracted. So it's fun because it's surprising and it's new, but it's not necessarily advantageous if your goal is to achieve learning and to bring these educational tools in the school. And
your lab at the University of Geneva, your field in general has been growing very strongly. You've received the Jacobs Research Prize and in general a very growing team. Why is there such a hype and so many questions now being brought to you and your colleagues?
We started this research 20 years ago. Video games was just a weird activity for a few nerds, mostly males. I think the hype is because this is very, very new on the scale of research. And as every research program, unfortunately, we're slow. So one of the things we'd like to do, and that's thanks to the Jacobs Foundation, is to really accelerate the curve of doing research in this area and create stronger networks where we can compete with how fast the industry is going. If you think about the pace of the industry in 2000, people were playing Doom, mostly on computers in the US that belonged to labs that had been funded by NIH or the DoD, because no other computers had the power to go and support the Doom graphics and activity. And Doom was still like, I don't know if you have looked at video games from 20 years ago, but like it's big pixels like that are moving around basically.
Does anybody know Doom? Yeah. Oh, very good, very good.
And fast forward, and we have had the tablet, the iPhone, social media. I don't know. I can't Twitter. The number of technological changes that have happened in 20 years is mind-boggling. And all we have been doing in 20 years is study one type of action video game. So we are miserable. We're not doing well on every scale. We need to do better. And actually, the funding of the Jacobs Foundation is going to be great to try to bring together more researchers on these topics.
What are the main challenges that you're working on?
So right now, one of the very exciting line of research is to understand what happens to the brain when an animal play. Because we know very little about the state in which the brain is when animals play.
The animal brain, not somebody watching, right?
The animal itself.
The animal brain, yeah.
Yeah, so we're working both in rodents with colleagues that actually have rats play hide and seek, and we have a protocol for having the same play behavior in rodents, children, and adults, all sort of through playing tag, and really trying to bridge from behavior all the way back to the neural and molecular basis of play. Because play has been hypothesized to be very important for learning, but at the neuroscientific level, we know almost nothing about why and how.
Why, yeah. Thank you. I'd like to open up already. Are there some, oh, yes, gentleman in the back.
Hi there. Daphne, question to you. How would you explain this gender gap, actually, if we're talking about gaming? Why do women do not play games on average as much as men do? How do you explain that?
Okay, so 20 years ago, that was true. But if you look at the ESA, which is the Entertainment Industry Report in the US, there's actually as many female gamers than there are male gamers. To tell you the truth, there are as many female gamers 50 plus than they are like 16 to 20 years old male playing. So they just don't play the same thing. I am a very good example. I have never played a shooter game. I don't like shooter games. So this the fact that the video game industry was created mostly by young males, 20 to 30 years old, and all they could think of was shooting games. But now that you have game designers that are actually female, you have many very interesting games that have very different feel, like Flow or Flowers, or like meditative games, like sort of adventure, more spiritual games. Now they are more variety, and the females have flocked in large number, but on these other titles.
We do have a very active scene here of game developers. I'm sure there's some of them among you guys. Any other questions? Yes?
Thank you very much. So you're an expert on these action games, but can you elaborate a bit on the different genres of games and how they benefit different things in the brain?
Thank you. I wish I could, lay it down for you and we had done it all. We know that, so this action game that we have studied are first or third person shooter games. At the time in 2000, if you know the game ecosystem, it made sense because it was actually really like pure shooter games. If you fast forward 20 years, probably the type of research we did 20 years ago, you cannot do anymore because what the gaming industry has done is to actually merge all different kinds of game mechanics and make our life really miserable. But to the extent that you can distinguish between different game genres, we know that the action-adventure type of game, like Skyrim, has some similar effect. Racing games has some similar effect. And real-time strategy games and the major MOBA. If you look at all of these, what we have identified is that there are common features, and all of these games require to make decisions under time pressure, to both have very distributed attention to figure out what's happening in surrounding, and at the same time be very focused on one item at a time, for example, when you shoot. And so these different mechanics we can unpack and show that if, to the extent that the game has these mechanics, you will get some of the effects that we have described.
Remember from one paper I've read from you, I think that social games in general don't have as much effect as strategic and shooter games. Is that still correct today?
So we distinguish, so social simulation games are often used as our control. But remember, it's not that they don't have as much effect. All I can tell you, and that's where the weakness of our work is about the cognitive effect. We have not looked at the social effect. We have not looked at the emotional effect. Like there's a lot of work still to be done. But social games don't have as much cognitive improvement effect as those action video games. And among the strategy games, the real-time strategy games have an effect. But the turn-based don't have in terms of cognitive effect. So it's quite specific, and it goes back to some of my remarks. You cannot talk about the impact of screen time on brain and behavior. Any book you pick up about that, any paper you pick up about that, just forget it. You're not going to learn anything. We know enough that you have to be specific.
Oh, yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Daphne. With regards to transfer, looking at the skills you probably learned during gaming sessions, riddles, puzzles, flexibility, and so on. There's always a question of transfer into the, say, real world. Where is the gap? Where is the problem of getting those skills into the average day?
So there's, I think, two questions in your question. The issue of transfer of learning is not new. It has been with us since the dawn of time, I would say, but schooling was certainly an example where, you get children in school, you teach them skills, and then your everyday life job is going to ask you rather different skills. And that was already a big issue in terms of transfer. Transfer is hard because we understand how the brain learns, and the brain learns by automatizing. Automatization means you're super efficient. Like right now, if those of you that have been driving for years will hop into a car and drive very efficiently. But if I change all the control of the car, even though sort of the mechanics is the same, it's going to take you some time to transfer your skills, right? Because this automaticity is going to get into the way, and you're going to have tendency to reach, for the gear on your right, but then it's on the left because you're in England or in Australia, and that's like that kind of automaticity needs to be inhibited. Then it's relearning, so it's actually hard to overcome. And we understand that it's different brain networks, like the basal ganglia is really important into automatic behavior. That's how the brain learns. We need to basically fight against that when we want transfer. And the best way to fight against that is to have the learner to always be challenged, always be on their toes in terms of reevaluating the way that they make decisions. And if you think about it, the video game world is amazing. In sports, I am a cricket expert, I am an NBA player. I'm not going to go from NBA to become first on a tennis court. In video games, what the video game industry has been doing is to actually change the rules of the game every season. So we talk about one game like Call of Duty, but it's actually wrong. If you look at what's being asked, each season of Call of Duty or League of Legends introduces new rules. It's a little bit like if you had chess, and then each season of chess, I tell you, oh, new board. Oh, you know what? The queen doesn't do that anymore. Go figure. But that's the best way to actually force transfer, because you're actually continuing stimulating this attentional control that we were talking about.
Thank you.
One moment. I think there's somebody in back. You've been holding up your hand up, no? No? Okay.
Yes, hi. You mentioned that screen time is irrelevant. So do you have a list of any practical best practices concerning children's age, game type, or content, let's say for pre-adolescent children?
So I'm certainly not the expert on that. A lot of my research has been more on later, like adolescent and adults. But to the extent that we are a small community and we've been looking really carefully at these issues because it's still unpacking. There's a shocking realization that society has decided to do an experiment of nature by putting tablets into the hands of toddlers when in fact they were actually designed for adults. Nobody expected that, but the market forces have run with it, and you now in the US have potty training with tablets and strollers with tablets and stuff like that. And really no one knows the full impact right now. So there are a number of colleagues that I have, especially in the US, where this is a kind of network we're talking about, and really following these children and then trying to see their behavior and interact before it becomes harmful by actually tracking the behavior on the tablet. So one of the ideas, instead of saying, don't do it, which we can't anymore because they are actually doing it, is to use what the new technologies has to offer, which is the ability to see the screen use. So like, the app that was downloadable on the iPhone by Apple about a year ago about your screen use and monitoring your different ways of screen use is part of that pressure from academia saying, we need you to give feedback to the users such that both the users and academics can actually titrate and tell you what's best. Now, right now where we're at is a recommendation is that for a very young age, 0 to 3, it's probably not a lot of pressure to put your super young children on a tablet if you can get them to do things and play with real materials. There are really good studies showing that this is important. Now, if they do a tablet half an hour here and there, no big deal. It's not going to be destructive. One of the things that we think is more problematic and what we see is that a lot of parents are using tablets as a new nanny. Little one, 9-month-old is cranky. Give him the tablet. And that creates that deleterious loop of the child learning that they're not going to get the attention of a human being, and they better sort of, do what get their enjoyment with those tablets. And so I think we need, or very early, we need to be very cautious. Later, like between 3 and 6, if we have a structured use, which is actually controlled use with adults that are able to engage around the technology, when I put the context of use, everybody agrees that there needs to be a human partner that is actually engaged in the discussion. And there are studies about that. That was true actually also of television. The best television program like Sesame Street didn't perform well unless there was an adult sharing with a kid and being able to debrief the kids. And by the way, this is actually research, there's very good research showing that debriefing around an experience is very important in part of the learning. And so we need all that. If you look at what's interesting is that for older children and for adults, this debriefing exists and naturally is actually been asked by players because there are communities of users, they talk to each other, they talk about their experience. But for children, we haven't really yet realized that this is something that is going to be really important so that they can have actually a community and a debriefing. And it's probably, we don't know yet whether doing it online is enough or being one-on-one, face-to-face is important. That question hasn't been asked yet.
No question also on this side of the room? Yes, sorry, you were first. Yeah.
So playing a video game means I'm basically glued to a screen, right? But in fact, typically, I'm also glued to a chair. So I don't move, I'm immobile. So what impact does immobility have on the capacity of the brain to learn? Because I could juggle, right, and decide pick it up or don't pick it up. I mean, which is sort of an embodied learning of how to throw balls up and catching them again. So the question is, does it actually have a positive effect that I'm not moving at all and just using my thumbs? Or would it enhance the capacity to learn if I would actually use my entire body with switch, for example, and playing tennis?
So it's a very good question. You have Dance Revolution, right? Which does both. The exact study you're asking hasn't been done. Yeah, there are studies on Dance Revolution and does it help, but like the executive function, for example, but there's a whole literature on the fact that being physically active is important for cognitive fitness. There's a literature on action video games and cognitive fitness. They haven't been put side by side in the way that you actually want. Now, one of the things that we know in terms of pushing cognitive fitness with these video games is that because it only uses your thumb, it allows for reaction times that are of split seconds that you couldn't have with your whole body. And so it seems to be pushing the edge on cognitive functioning in young adults in a way that sports alone cannot do it. So actually the way that, what they do in sports training is that they actually get the athletes to train on the field, but also to train on video game, to train this aspect of being extremely pushing to the edge reactivity, but also this attentional control and this flexible allocation of attention under very, very strict time demands.
Yes.
Hi, Daphne.
Hi.
I wear glasses and I work at the screen. And would it help me to play in the evening some video games? And what kind of I have to play then?
So I don't know whether you're a player or not.
No, I don't. I would start if it helps.
Then don't start with first or third person shooter game, because these games are actually designed for young adults that are already part of the video game community. But if you start with the kind of Mario Kart or racing games, and then you bring your way up, your vision will improve. That doesn't mean you may do away with your glasses, but you are going to maintain, from our studies, what we have seen in young adults, we can actually get them to be better in terms of contrast sensitivity and in terms of visual acuity, so reading the fine print.
We'll hear more from Amy Ogan, who'll come later, about how we can use technology also to train in schools. There's one question I would also like to ask you a bit more broader. What are some fields in society where you feel we should start using gamification more?
Ooh, tricky question. I'm not sure that I am convinced that gamification is always a winner. Gamification can be a winner, but it can also be a loser. So it's different from playing a video game than to gamify an experience. And so maybe I'm being a bit too technical, but for those of us in the field, a lot of the misconception is, you take the content that's come from Facebook and then you gamify it by putting little coins here and little reward there, and it's going to be way more fun and the child is going to learn more. That doesn't work. What you need to do is you need to take the content of the book and rethink it entirely differently as an experience that is going to be an embodied experience and leading a quest, and you sort of need a narrative around it. You really need to have another layer that is nothing to do with writing a textbook. And so in the case of learning, if you want to learn geography, video games would be great, but you're not going to get me to learn geography just by doing a quiz and say, what's the capital of Tanzania? It's much more fun if
if you find it out.
Yeah, exactly. The best learning software have actually some kind of ultimate goal, and you're working toward that goal, and you need to remember information to reach that goal, but that goal is not directly related to learning geography. That goal is another goal, and that's why video games are so powerful when they are done well, is that they can actually lead the player to acquire a lot of information in the goal of that quest, but without realizing that they're actually learning all that geography.
Thank you very much, Daphne.
Thank you.
We'll have a break and meet here again at 9 o'clock and hear Amy Ogan. And you're sticking around, and
sure,
you might be available for questions.
Yeah, I'll be delighted.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back. Our next guest, as I said before, is Amy Ogan. She's a professor of learning science at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. She's in educational technologies, so she wants to make learning experience more engaging, to bring tech to schools, to the students. She actually works with real teachers, real schools, real first-hand experience, so we can actually pick up where we left with Daphne. Please welcome Amy.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. I'm so happy to be here tonight. And I just wanted to mention that back in 2000, I was spending all of my free time playing adventure games. If anybody is familiar with Myst or Return to Zurich, that's how I was spending my evenings. Now, fast forward 20 years later, and I'm a professor of human-computer interaction. Maybe there's some connection between the two. Not sure, but right now my work is centered around ideas of learning science and also artificial intelligence. And I'm the head of a research lab at Carnegie Mellon, where, along with many indispensable partners and many others besides, we're investigating the following question. How do we design technologies that support all learners equitably across contexts, levels, and platforms? And so many times when people think of educational technologies, they're thinking of, putting kids in front of a computer, or they're thinking about online courses or video lectures that you could join. But my work, I'm going to take off on a little different tack than Daphne did and talk about pushing the boundaries of ed tech and what can we do today with AI that helps us change our behaviors and then in turn our brains as well. And so these technologies held a lot of promise. They talked a lot about changing the landscape of education, about introducing equity into educational opportunities. They largely have not yet found that promise. But in my lab, we've worked with a lot of advanced technologies that are starting to actually realize some of these visions. And instead, we're thinking about how we can use AI to reduce inequality through contextually relevant educational technologies. And it's easy to think about technology that you're going to sort of parachute in and hopefully just completely transform a classroom that's in need of an educational opportunity. But what we look at in my work is understanding the social and cultural factors of the classroom, in addition to those student needs that are individualized, in order to inform the design of systems that actually show long-term success in engagement and efficacy. And in order to do that, we've built a lot of different technologies. We've done a lot of extensive fieldwork with them across 4 continents. We look across socioeconomic status, across genders, across ethnicities, to understand what really works. And one of the things that we've found here in this project called RoboTutor is that one of the things we need to do for young learners engaging with literacy opportunities is that the technology itself needs to listen to the learner. So as you'll hear in this video clip.
Tafadhali sema hadithi kwa sauti.
Fisi na kunguru walikuwa marafiki sana hapo awali.
So this is a technology that we've deployed in sub-Saharan Africa, across Tanzania, with the Global Learning X Prize, in which our team was one of the 5 finalists, who were able to deploy the technology across 200 villages, comparing the results from engaging on an individual basis with a technology like this that actually listens and hears the learner and can react back, compared to their typical classroom practice, where there may be 90 or 100 students in the classroom and the teacher has no time for individual attention. And what we've seen is learning gains up to 3 or 4 times that of their normal educational practices. Now, a different way for a technology to listen to a learner is to let the students get a chance to be the teacher themselves and feel powerful and in control while learning, by acting as the teacher for virtual characters such as this. So in this project, our rapport-aligned peer tutor, what you can see is that the technology is actually building a relationship with the learner, while the learner themselves is teaching this character the mathematics. So the learner might be a beginner themselves, but they still feel like they're in control and in power in this situation as they're supporting their protege here in learning the mathematics themselves. And we use AI to do this because what is needed in this relationship is the ability to get students through crises of confidence, to engage sometimes even in productive conflict with the learner in order to get to a new understanding. And these are really difficult processes that are critical for 21st century understanding. And yet, they may need to be enhanced beyond what each learner is able to do in a traditional classroom. An even bigger challenge for us has been to engage with supporting equity in the careers of the future. And so one of the things that has been found to be true to date in the United States is that girls tend to feel currently less comfortable with robotics and with programming. And one of the reasons for that is the disconnect between this robot as a tool and the social experience that they have in all of the rest of their learning. And so in this project, we're building on the Anki robot to actually create a robot that talks back to you while you're programming it. And so we call these social programmable robots, and they actually engage with the learner. Let's say you drive your robot accidentally off the table. It might fall to the floor, and does it say, "That's okay, you got it, next time, pick me back up and let's try again"? Or does it say, "Really? Get me up there and start all over again, you can do it," right? We've got lots of personas and lots of ways engaging with learners, and we can make this adaptive to what the learner needs at that time. Now, in order to get these interactions right, what we find is that it's critical to use AI to model all different aspects of the learner. So this might include what the learner knows and what they can do, but also their emotional state. For example, being able to detect confusion or frustration or engagement through things like tracking facial expressions and posture and movement and their social experiences. And so in some of our latest work, we're actually moving this to classroom scale, removing the need for students to sit in front of a computer all day in order to get the same benefit. So here you can see some of our work looking at a classroom where we can find all the people, all of their faces. You can see who's raising their hands, who's not raising their hands, how engaged people are, and many other factors of their experience in the classroom. And one of the things that you can do with this is actually use it to make visible what is often invisible in the classroom, things that the teacher themselves may not even be aware of. So are they focusing only on the front of the classroom, and those are the students who are getting the attention? Or the loudest student who's in the back and who takes up all of their time? So which students are not being given the same opportunity as everyone else, and how can we support them to their best potential? In a sense, trying to unlock superpowers for a teacher. But what I'm really excited about here is also flipping the script and talking about optimizing for teachers and their own behavior. So one of the problems with teaching today, particularly in my case as a university professor, is we get no training on how to teach and no feedback on how we're doing as we go about doing it. By putting cameras in the classroom but flipping them so that we're actually looking at the teacher's behavior, we finally have a chance to be able to give teachers feedback on a daily, regular basis, exactly what students need, right? Now we're able to give it to the teacher in order to help them change their own behavior. Of course, not every classroom can have, a whole sensing system and AI in the room and be able to provide that sort of feedback in that high-tech, sort of expensive approach to tracking and producing learners' outcomes. Instead, sometimes we need to work in environments where what's present there might be just a smartphone, but teachers who are familiar with using that smartphone, for instance, with technologies like WhatsApp. And so here's a project, SEME, where we are using AI on the back end and using a WhatsApp front interface so that teachers can actually get the support that they need by putting a master teacher in the loop and yet supporting the master teacher to be able to engage with 250 teachers at the same time, something they wouldn't be able to do on an individual basis. Of course, in some environments, maybe those smartphones aren't even present. And here in this project called Allo Alphabet, we're working on teaching literacy through the use of a basic phone. So all the capabilities it has are voice and SMS. And yet, even so, we're able to use AI to provide literacy lessons to this child you see on the left here, where he's actually brought his school book home and is practicing along with the book and on the phone at the same time. One of the things I find exciting about this work is the community involvement that it engages as well. So not only is this child sitting here and learning lessons over the phone, what we've built in are group games that the children can play together as they're learning, but we find that also a whole variety of community members are able to engage with this system and support each learner in a different way, even if they themselves may not have the literacy ability to be able to teach the child themselves. And so in this case, that might involve motivational support, where a parent is sitting here and helping ensure that the child is continuing to engage with the literacy tasks. We've actually also built a parent-facing system in which the parent themselves is able to access the same lesson that the child is working on, and sometimes the parents are using this to support their own gains in literacy as well. Importantly, what we find here is that it's not just parents who are engaged, but all the community members who live around and are engaged in that child's life. And so today it might be a parent, but tomorrow it might be an aunt, it might be a cousin. And with the use of this technology that anyone can access from their own basic phone, we're able to support this network of learners that really come together to provide the highest quality opportunity for these children. So that was a whole lot about the promises of educational technology, the advances we're making today and what we can do with it. But of course, as I'm sure you were thinking as you were watching some of those videos, this type of educational technology is producing a plethora of fine-grained data about the learner. And so that's one of those places where we have to be concerned and think about, what are we doing with that data? Who has access to it? How are they using it? And is it being used for the benefit of the learner or for selling them some other product or technology? Well, that's one of the concerns that I think we should be working on addressing. We're in the process of developing frameworks that can help us regulate the use of this data. For instance, if you're a teacher, do you want the administration to see your data about how you're performing in the classroom, or should that be privately held and only available to yourself? How does the administration feel about allowing the teacher to use their own data and giving them your blessing to not look at that data with them? So this is one of the concerns that we're working through. The other is to think, again, about how we produce these effective, equitable learning outcomes with such technologies. And although Daphne and I didn't coordinate at all before this talk, we both ended in the same place, which is that the quality is not in the medium. So it's not about having a smartphone. It's not about having a basic phone or a sensing system in the classroom. It's really about the design. It's about how you use it, who's using it, and that piece that I think is so critical, the human-computer interaction. And so our Human-Computer Interaction Institute has been around for 25 years. It was our anniversary this year, so a little bit longer than the game research has been going on, but it's still a relatively new field. And so we're still exploring all of these issues, but this is a place where psychology, design, and advanced technologies come together in order to really tackle these challenges of justice, equity, and fairness for all learners. And I'm looking forward to engaging in further discussion with you all about these issues.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you. When I looked at your work, and you've just confirmed it with your slides, is that you work a lot with smartphones. Mm-hmm. So forgive me for the very trivial question, but what do these phones actually do?
Well, that depends on the product. So again, I will say that it's not about the medium. So whether it's a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop screen, typically they have very similar capabilities. And the question is really how you use them. So one of the challenges that we have with a smartphone compared to a tablet or a laptop screen is that the screen real estate is quite small. You only have so much space to be able to present something to the learner. And we know this has an effect on how we learn because some of the underlying principles of good learning opportunities are that things that are important and go together are spatially next to one another. So when you have a smartphone, that's a challenge that you have to deal with. How do you present a mathematics problem where the diagram is on a different page or a different screen than on the place where the problem is being laid out? So to go back to the question, we use all of the capabilities from text messaging to speech to screen interactions, touch interactions.
And when you mentioned the WhatsApp, for example,
yes.
Does that work in a way that the teacher can actually ask for support and then gets a WhatsApp, or how does it work?
Yes, precisely. Yeah. So if you're familiar with WhatsApp, it's really just a messaging application. You can put together groups, you can speak to individuals, you can send video or images, and so we use all of those capabilities. However, on the back end, behind the scenes, there's a lot of processing happening. For instance, you are a teacher and you want to ask the master, teacher, trainer a question. We send that off. Now, our system on the other end checks, have we seen that question before? Is it similar to another question we've seen? Maybe we can send you an answer right away. If not, maybe we need to actually send it to the master trainer and they can address it. Maybe they want to now use the system to create some additional training because that question was so important or so good it needs to spread to the rest of the group. Mm-hmm. So it's really on the phone. For a teacher, it looks just the same as if they were typically using a messaging app. You can see your contacts, you can see your group, you can send questions or answer questions. But on the other end, we're processing it, figuring out who needs that material, whether it's similar to other material, and a variety of other options that help us sort of optimize the time for each of the participants, but also maximize the opportunities for learning.
So you try, as you said, to optimize as much as possible, to
yes.
make it more efficient also.
While still keeping humans in the loop who are able to add their own expertise, whether it's the content, the motivation, or anything else that's needed above and beyond what the technology is going to do.
I'll open up in a minute, but I have one more question. How do the parents react to these kind of projects?
So, of course, that depends on the context. Mm-hmm. You might have, a rich parent in Silicon Valley who says, "I don't want my child using any technology. Let's get that out of here." So, sort of got flipped around to the other side. The parents that we're working with in Côte d'Ivoire are enormously excited about these opportunities, not just because of what the technology can do, but they also view this as a way for their child to progress beyond what they've had the experience with, to join, modern society, and this is how they view it. Learning with technology is the future, and they want to be a part of that future.
Thank you. Are there any questions already? Yes. Yep.
For me, it sounded like it's kind of like Western education methods that are spread all over the world. So is there like an ethical question to it? Like, are there local people who bring education into these programs? Because for me, it sounds like it brings more fairness to a classroom, but also it helps Western education to spread and maybe get rid of other forms of knowledge systems, for example.
Well, thank you for that question, because I would hate to leave you all with the impression that that's what we're doing. As I noted in the beginning, we do extensive field work before we design or implement any type of solution. So we might be in a country for 2 years before we actually create a product and deploy it. However, at the same time, we are always working alongside, and you saw some of them on my slide, local partners who engage with us in those activities, oftentimes from a local university, or sometimes, if that's not available, community members who are doing co-design of these practices with us. And so we very much hope to avoid exactly that situation, although sometimes there are Western practices already ingrained in a post-colonial system that might be in place. And so we're constantly questioning, are we reinforcing that? Is that what the families, the parents, the government wants to be reinforced? Or are there alternative approaches that we can take? We do regularly get pushback on some of these issues, and when we do, we welcome that and we try to engage with it to understand what the alternatives are and how we might actually produce something that is contextually relevant.
Yes, gentleman in the back? Yeah. No. Mic's not working?
Closer like
Good.
this? Okay. We humans like to exploit systems, I guess, and when we have a game or something, we like to cheat. And especially with AI, there's always kind of these weird exploits. So in those, let's say those tutor learning systems, do you see any like behavior of specific exploitation to get out of the learning?
Yeah, right. That is definitely human nature. Actually, one funny example that we have isn't even around the learning opportunities. It was about how we we co-designed a shared system so that multiple children could use the same device and work with it. And one of the ways that we allowed that to happen was the kids got to take a selfie, and then they got to log in with their picture if they weren't reading yet. And of course, what we found was they loved taking selfies. So they just created thousands of logins so that they could take pictures of themselves. So we used that experience to redesign the system so that there were opportunities for selfie taking throughout the experience, and they really had fun with it. So in our field, we call that gaming the system. And we do see that at times. And then the key is to really keep the pulse on that data, understand when and where it's happening, and try to either reduce that behavior or positively reinforce other types of behaviors that we would like to see. Sometimes they're doing it in ways that are amazing. So you've found out a better way to solve this math problem. That's great. Sometimes it's a behavior that you don't want to see, like repeatedly clicking until you get the final answer because the system's just going to give it to you. And then we try to think about how we might encourage alternatives. One thing that we saw in our data, for instance, was to, in certain countries where we were working, we saw these enormous long pauses between one attempt at solving a problem and the next attempt. And in the United States, this is a really bad thing. So they're off doing something else. They, come back and they haven't thought about it. They try it again, but they're not putting any energy or effort into actually working on the material. When I was working in Costa Rica, what we found was that time was actually the kids going around and checking with all of their friends to see if they had the answer or if they could help them solve the problem. So there's also a real need to understand why a behavior is happening rather than just trusting in the data.
Next question. Guy in the middle and then on the back.
So what is your vision of education, let's say in 20 years? I'm not a teacher, so no comfort needed, but can you imagine a an education system without actual human people teaching?
We get asked that question a lot, so it's a really great one to think about. What does the future of education look like? Certainly there's been lots of science fiction written about a future where there are no teachers. I mean, there's always opportunities for learning where there's no teacher, right? You can be a child and you can learn at home and you can pick up a book, you can watch a video, you can do all sorts of things and learn by yourself. That doesn't mean that there's no value in having a human in the loop, however. And so many of the systems that we design are actually expected to help change the role of the teacher rather than to remove them entirely. So for instance, you might now have a teacher who is freed to walk around the room and engage with children who are really struggling and spend quality time with them and support them in moving forward rather than having to teach to the middle of the class, the average, on a lecture at a blackboard. And so I think that's more of the vision that we see, is that there are facilitators, coaches, teachers, people who are serving a lot of different roles, but who are we're able to enhance their capabilities, make them more effective, give them superpowers rather than taking them out of the education system.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back was first. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm wondering, what does the parent in Silicon Valley know about the impact on education and the use of technology in education that the parent in Côte d'Ivoire does not? Or in other words, how robust are the data that suggest that the impact of technology in education is positive or negative?
Good question. So a couple of ways to tackle that. One is to come back to this idea again that educational technology is not a force for good or a force for evil in our educational system. It all depends on how it's used, what content is there, how the interaction unfolds with the technology. And so some of what you're seeing from those parents is reactionary. We think screen time is bad, so we should get children off of it. The other part, however, comes from the fact that those wealthier parents, the children often have enormous amounts of time and opportunity to engage with technology in general. And so they may see the education system as a time where they can remove some of those distractions and focus on what they're doing cognitively or physically for learning. Whereas a parent in Côte d'Ivoire, the child doesn't have those opportunities and isn't spending 3/4 of their day on a smartphone or heads down with a video. And so they're viewing the experience very differently, as an opportunity or as a continued distraction. So I think there's room for balance. I think maybe just putting your faith in technology is not the right way to go, but also saying that it has no place and we should divorce our education system from the reality of today's world in which technologies are supporting all types of positive interactions is also probably not the right way to go. So if everybody can look for a balance and understand the limits and the expectations around the technology, I think that's a better world.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? On the left. Sorry, I don't see you back there. I'm so sorry. It's too dark.
Yes.
Right?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about self-reflection and self-guidance, and if the technology where the video can analyze your emotions and give you a picture of it can enhance or maybe disconnect from how you would yourself reflect on what is happening to you and the guidance that you need.
Yes, great question. So one of the skills that learners need to develop as they're going through school and life in general is not just about the cognitive knowledge that one needs to gain, the facts or the skills, but also a skill called metacognition, knowing how I learn best, understanding whether I know something or don't know something, the ability to reflect on my own learning and understand it. And that's a really hard skill to develop. It's a set of skills in and of itself. And so previously, we've had very little way to give students feedback on that skill and help support them in acquiring it. And so I think actually there is a lot of opportunity for using that type of knowledge about the learner to guide them in gaining that skill. And one of the ways that some researchers are looking at this is called open learner models, where they're exposing all of this data that we're able to collect to the learner themselves and hopefully helping them use it in that way. But I think there's a lot more opportunity, and it's not something we're doing incredibly well right now.
Lady in the back, third row or second row. Peter? Peter?
Given the amount of diagnostic information, do you find that it's easier to diagnose when people have learning difficulties? And how do you apply that to other countries where they're not using WhatsApp and things like that as a learning material?
Yes, so we are able to do things like understand whether a learner has dyslexia much better once we have this sort of data that's fine-grained and that's over time, and we can use that technology to produce reports or to notifications to alert somebody who might actually check and engage with that. But you bring up an excellent second issue, which is that these types of things look different depending on your culture, and not only learning disabilities, but all of the other factors that I mentioned as well, emotional expression, norms for interactions. And so we have some research out that looks at this across a set of countries where we find that the data, in fact, looks very different depending on where you're from. The other evidence that we have for this, or one other piece of evidence, is that we first always use humans to code the data before we develop an artificial intelligence system that might use that data. And what we find is that our research assistants, our humans who are looking at data in the United States, cannot reliably identify these states of being for learners in Mexico or learners in the Philippines. You actually have to be from that local context in order to understand what's happening in the learning environment. And so for me, this is a major question, and one of enormous research interest is how do we ensure that we're building systems that account for that, rather than taking one model from Europe or from the United States and applying it everywhere, whether it's for learners with disabilities or for learners who are coming from a different context and background. That is one of those issues where, again, I think regulation and frameworks need to be in place, and everybody needs to be more aware of these issues before we just blanket go about spreading technologies without a thought to where are our learners coming from and what do they look like.
Sorry, Peter?
I think there are like about 35 to 40,000 educational apps on the App Store, and most of them are bullshit, right? I mean, can you as an expert tell, a layperson, a parent or a teacher or a child themselves, what to look for? I mean, not brands, but we need guidance. I mean, that's probably the most urgently needed thing in this field.
Yes. Fantastic. I think this also relates back to that question around what do wealthy parents in Silicon Valley know about educational opportunities and how technology fits in that others don't. Well, one thing is that for the average person looking at that app store, it's really difficult to know what's good and what's not good. And it's really easy to give your child a piece of technology, let them have at it because it's educational, and 100 hours later, have they actually achieved any results from it? It's really difficult as a layperson to assess that impact. And it's actually even really difficult for some experts to do that too. It comes to mind a famous game that won lots of awards for teaching algebra. Kids loved it, spent tons of time on it. Parents were so excited. Game designers were excited. Conducted a study. Kids could play the game. They thought they knew algebra, gave them a paper test, no advance whatsoever. So there you go. Now you've spent all of your spare time playing this game that never achieved the learning goals that one thought it was going to achieve. With that said, there are two ways to go about doing this. One is to do a learning principles assessment. So we have sets of principles that have been widely tested, granted, widely tested in Western contexts. So this is another place where I'm going to limit myself to say, who knows, maybe that technology is going to work somewhere else. But you could go through a checklist of these principles that have been tested in study after study and say, yep, here's a problem, this isn't going to achieve your goal. That's on a surface level, but really, secondarily, we need to have learning goals defined. So what precisely do you think your child is going to get out of playing this app? And that should come from the designer of the educational app themselves. And then ideally, they have some evidence that shows that somebody's actually achieving those specific learning goals. And that's going to help a parent or a layperson check, again, is this something? Is this list the things that I want my child to be learning? And can I see any impact on my child after they've played it? So a parent could do that assessment themselves if they have it laid out for them what the expectations are and what they should be looking for afterwards.
And the time and the money to do it, going back to Second Life.
Yes, so, we are happy to do this and look at these apps, but one of the ways that this has been happening not for educational apps on an app store, but for even curricula or educational technologies that might go into a school system as a whole, is a space called the What Works Clearinghouse. And this is something that has been implemented in the United States by the federal government, where they look at evidence coming out of randomized controlled trials with real students, and they make a determination about whether that evidence fits their standards. If it does, it starts to get included in this list of technologies that have been evaluated to a high standard, have been found to show positive impacts in a large-scale study, and then teachers, administrators, or purchasers for technologies at a school level can go in and look at that. You could certainly imagine something of the sort happening. Maybe Apple could put it in place so that they actually have some verified content, and that would be an added value for all of their users to be able to go in and see, all right, these apps are actually doing what they say they're doing, and you take some of the time and money out of it for parents.
We're going to have drinks in a moment, but I would like to ask one last question because I think it's important. Have you been approached by companies who are trying to get into the classrooms to collect data that they can then use to sell products again to children? Or would it be possible you could be approached?
Yes, it is definitely possible. It has tended to be more subtle than that. So the people who care enough to put their time and effort into working with researchers have a long-term vision. They are thinking 20 years in the future. We want to be in on the ground right now and have, our class insight system and understand, the ways that's working and what the future of the classroom is going to look like. Somebody who's trying to sell an educational app, they want it now. They want to just get that out there, and they know there are lots of alternatives. Parents are going to buy it. They don't need the research to show that it works at this point in time. So yeah, it's something that we have to be careful about and really think about what, if any, engagements we take on with industry, because there's also the opportunity to help shape the direction things are going for good.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you very much to the audience. We'll have drinks just outside, right? Is that correct? Yes. So please stay a bit, have a good evening, enjoy. Thank you very much for coming.